I'm Kevin Davis, and this is the Catholic Family Podcast. And yes, I hope by now you recognize my face, and you also recognize his face as well, because, well, we just had part one a bit ago, depending on when I published this. We recorded that, when was that? Yesterday already. And this is Mr. Griff Ruby, and in part one, we talked about his journey to Catholicism, which was a very interesting journey, kind of came from absolutely nothing and found Christianity in high school, and then traditional Catholicism kind of through the CMRI or an ex-CMRI nun. Really interesting story. I highly recommend anyone who hasn't watched that one to go back and check that out, because that'll give you a bit of a basic footprint into what we're getting into now, because now we're getting into more of the meat and potatoes, and then we plan for part three to be more of the cherry on top of the ice cream, I suppose, which you're going to get into more of the theory of Sedevacantism. Today, we're talking about the second book. So the first book I should mention was called Resurrection of Traditional Catholicism, which we mentioned and talked about in part one. Today, we're talking about Sedevacante part one, and then in part three, we'll talk about Sedevacante part two. And so before we wanted to get into your book, Sedevacante, you wanted to mention a little bit more. You wanted to wrap up kind of the book, The Resurrection, that we talked about in part one. So where do you want to start today?
Well, I'm going to start with the one part of it that after we all hung up, I thought, oh, I wanted to get to this one other thing. I really had intended to do this, and then it didn't happen. And it had to do with an Appendix A of the resurrection of the Roman Catholic Church, actually to be precise, but okay. Appendix A, which was the Pope, I titled it, The Pope Condemns Vatican II. And the reason I titled it that way, well, I was kind of grappling in my mind at one point with this accusation of, oh, we're breaking with the Pope. We're not following the Pope, blah, blah, blah. You get that from the Novus Ordo all the time. And, and the liberals are, who cares what you do? But the conservatives are, you're breaking with the Pope. Well, actually, the Pope is telling us, what we're supposed to believe, obviously. And so that's when I kind of started to go through, well, let's look at the proclamations of the popes specifically. And this is where I began using what I call the longer quotes. They take more time to read, but that's because what is all said in there is all crucial. A short quote is something very easy to misapply, to take out of context, and so forth. When you have a short quote, you could do anything with it. I illustrated in the first part how a quote from William Jurgens in his volumes quoting or discussing about the ancient fathers made it sound like all the ancient fathers didn't believe in baptism of blood or desire. And then you look at the quote in context as actually given, they did. It's only that they didn't believe in that as applicable to infants. So that's a very strong, in my mind, illustration of the importance of getting quotes in context. Let the speaker, in this case the Pope, or in other cases the various theologians or canonists or anybody else we may quote, speak at length to the question. Let them be the professors. And I just kind of sit back and just soak it in, and then as almost a parenthetical footnote. So you see, everybody, he says this, he says that. What does that tell us, kind of a thing? So,
and real quick, I want to mention real quick, because I think that's such an amazing point in our times, because I call it Twitter theology, because it's one of these things that it is, as you say, it's this really short. You take a quote and you just throw it out there. You just throw it out a quote and you say, okay, now everyone, here's the quote, now believe it. And as you say, it's missing context. It could be missing an entire paragraph, an entire page, an entire book surrounding it that explains that quote. If you just take one quote as it is, who knows what that could be implied, what you can take from that. And that's super dangerous.
What
and
I think say about it. Yeah.
Right.
Believe
and that's why it's good that you
it.
say that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I use that trick. Well, let's get, it's not really a trick. It's an approach, actually, but it was something that, I haven't seen a lot of in the other writings and so forth. One of the things that led to my book, besides that, was as I started meeting up with every traditional group, I started subscribing to all the traditional magazines, finding all the books from every school of thought, and I read them all. let's just say by the time I was writing my resurrection book, my knowledge of the traditional Catholic movement or community had become truly encyclopedic. I can't say I've kept every detail up to date. A number of priests and writers and so forth have come and gone since I really had researched everything that thoroughly. But the basic points have all stayed the same. And the same questions come up again and again in new generations. So anyway, I was concerned about people saying, oh, you're not with the Pope. Oh, are we? Actually, we are. And that's where I decided to go through and just quote different popes on the things done to the liturgy, on the things done to morality, to response to communism, to response to ecumenism. I mean, Mortalium Animos from Pope Pius XI gets a lot of attention here because it's like that just, is a kick in the stomach to the whole idea of let's all get all warm and fuzzy and ecumenical with every shade of heretic you can find. So, I mean, it's just all these kinds of teachings. And then, like I say, use a long passage. Let the Pope speak for himself rather than just, you could find some short passage and say, see, Pope Pius IX says this, or 11th, or whatever the number may be. And yeah, he did say that. Let's see if I could just find an example that's not too long that would pertain to that one. In fact, I'd like to do that. Okay. So I introduce him as Pope Pius XI continued this teaching. I'd already been talking about, let's see, Syllonism and indifferentism and some of the other things. I have a lot of quotes from the Syllabus of Errors, as I always list as condemned proposition number, because it's all these things that have been condemned. So I want to make it clear because, I got to discipline myself here. I have an article called Something About Denzinger on Daily Catholic, if you want to understand what I was going to bring up. Look at the phrase something about Denzinger, but okay. Anyway, so Pope Pius XI continued this teaching against putting religious error on the level with truth in his encyclical Mortalium Animos, which certainly bears reading straight through, but I just give paragraph 2 in full, and it goes like this. Assured that there exist few men who are entirely devoid of the religious sins, they seem to ground on this belief a hope that all nations, while differing indeed in religious matters, may yet without great difficulty be brought to fraternal agreement on certain points of doctrine which will form a common basis of the spiritual life. With this object, congresses, meetings, and addresses are arranged, attended by a large concourse of hearers, where all, without distinction, unbelievers of every kind, as well as Christians, even those who unhappily have rejected Christ and denied his divine nature or mission, are invited to join in the discussion. Now, such efforts can meet with no kind of approval among Catholics. They presuppose the erroneous view that all religions are more or less good and praiseworthy, inasmuch as all give expression under various forms to that innate sense which leads men to God and to the obedient acknowledgement of his rule. Those who hold such a view are not only in error, they distort the true idea of religion and thus reject it, falling gradually into naturalism and atheism. To favor this opinion, therefore, and to encourage such undertakings is tantamount to abandoning the religion revealed by God. That's only one paragraph, but at least it's long enough. You get a pretty good idea of what the Pope has to say about such gatherings as Vatican II.
Well, and now, and anyone who's watching this now, look at what Bergoglio is doing and how he is, embracing pagan goddesses. So, who do we trust now? Do we trust Bergoglio or do we trust Pius XI? Ask yourself very, very closely.
So when I say I am siding with the Pope, I do in this exact point, and on all the others, I side with Pope Pius XI and 12, and well, let's see. Let me read off the list again of the different popes that I've quoted in there, all at length. Well, the syllabuses of error and also Pascendi, not the Pascendi, but the one, the Lamentabili Sani. The other, those documents are just little short statements, but other than that, everything is long. So let's see, that would be Paul III, Julius III, as popes involved with the Council of Trent, St. Pius V, Benedict XIV, Gregory XVI, Pius IX, Leo XIII, St. Pius X, Pius XI, and Pius XII. So I've quoted quite a number of popes in support of what the Catholic truth is, and obviously at the total rejection of the whole Vatican II religion on so many particulars. The popes of the past of the church have seen bits and pieces of what would become the Novus Ordo religion, and at every turn they always categorically rejected it, shot it down, condemned it, and that to me is what I called, by the name of the chapter, the Pope condemns Vatican II.
But I mean, I just don't understand, because Saint Paul VI and Saint John Paul II and Saint John Paul I and Saint, who's the other anti-pope saint? They all, totally changed and went against these other popes. So how could, what's the issue here? What's the difference? I mean, they are okay with ecumenism and they're saints. So must be okay.
And Pius X is a saint, and some of these others either are or very close to it, and all right, and St. Pius X is also a saint. So who do I go with? Or do I just say, well, that's one? Well, Pius V is another saint.
Right.
So, I mean, besides, I think we've kind of seen how saintism gets passed around like Halloween candy these days. You just look at the Novus Ordo funeral, and it's, they canonize the deceased, which, in all but the rarest of circumstances, is just not called for. You don't comment on the state of the deceased, unless you really have a lot of reason for people to realize this could have been a saint, or could have been, very saintly, or, I find this person, this or that wonderful thing. But when you really go beyond that, when you start calling somebody a saint or making it sound like, oh, so-and-so is surely in heaven. He was such a nice person. He gave those ladies rides to their abortion clinics. And, he was just doing stuff for these. He's such a good person, Right. And they'll canonize that.
Well, and it makes sense. It makes sense that they canonized these anti-popes because they needed to, right? They needed to canonize Vatican II because they knew that it's full of garbage, and they knew that it contradicts the teachings of the church. And so if, in order to protect that or give it a bit of a cushion, then you canonize these popes who promulgated it, so that, what can you say? I mean, you can't, how can you argue against Vatican II when it was promulgated by saints? And it's pretty smart.
Well, I don't know. I guess by that standard, I could canonize myself, and then therefore everything I say becomes perfect. Sure. Right. Does anybody see the weakness in that? Right. Yeah. I mean, unfortunately, it's a mutual admiration society. That's what I see. To say nothing of the fact that their whole process for canonization, insofar as they pretend to bother with one at all, has been denuded of everything.
Right.
The standards are just so low that even your nice guy who even takes the girls to the abortion clinic could meet those criteria.
Right. No, that's true.
So
I mean, I guess that leads us into what is, why did you write the book Sedevacantism, I suppose? That's the first question. And what's it about? I mean, why do we believe that the seat of Rome, that the papacy, the seat of the Pope in Rome, has been empty since 1958? And obviously you wrote a book about it.
That's right. But I decided to take a somewhat different approach because usually what people have talked about is the basic case that shows, is this person a pope or not? Here are these dogmas that tell us what Catholic popes are, what successors of Peter are, what they can do, what they can't do. And yes, there are things they can do that might not be very good. They can, they can be personally corrupt. It's happened. They can engage in the sin of nepotism by promoting their nieces or nephews and other key people to key roles in, the various, the dioceses, the religious houses, whatever, and so forth, not out of merit, but simply because, well, I'll do anything for my nephew kind of thing. They can be rightly accused of being at times imprudent on things and so forth. So But what can't they do is they cannot teach us error. They cannot teach us heresy. They cannot contradict anything, defined or taught universally by the church before they came along. And so when you see someone who's thought of as Pope doing these things, the test, first you really make sure they're doing that. You're not talking about an accidental misspeaking or something, that they really said what it sounds like they said, they really mean it, and they really intend to impose it on everybody. And you look at that, and it's like this, and what the church has taught clearly, and at least doctrinally or even dogmatically, they can't be reconciled. You have somebody who has just demonstrated that they cannot be Pope. Now, that may be what removed them from it, or it may just be more evidence that they are not in the papacy. And that'll be another issue as we get more into all of this. So these long quotes proved very helpful. I used them again when I did my series on Father Feeney. Again, the Feeniites had these short quotes, which were very easy to pull out of context, and they have a bunch of them they do that too. But again, all of these quotes lose their power to fool people when you put them in the full context of the paragraph or page or two or whatever where it appears. And you see it in its full form, and you realize what's really being said by the various fathers, doctors, saints, theologians, popes, anybody else you're quoting, what's really being said. And that keeps you from the errors that people can grab onto by finding a sentence that sounds good to them and just latching onto that and running with it and making their own ideas up as to what it's supposed to be. So I use that a lot there. And there you're dealing with a lot of misquotes and misapplications, whereas I don't know very many people who are misquoting the popes on any of the things I said in my Appendix 1. Now, later on, I began to realize I'd hoped that when I came out with that resurrection book, people, priests, religious bishops, everybody would, who look at this would be able to see, oh, yes, we need to focus on, the traditional Catholics as the church, because we are the church. I mean, let's think about that for a moment. I contend that traditional Catholics are the church. You might be able to think of some people who would say otherwise. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I would disagree. Yep, I know what you're saying. I know who you're pointing at. I think with the material aspect of it.
Well, I think that's a broader point than just one specific group here.
Right.
But in a way, that's kind of part of it, because they're looking at an organized society of heretics, and they're looking to them to provide us with a pope. I don't even know how they justify that one, but I'll leave that to them. Have to be respectful. You never know. Plus, I don't call somebody a heretic because their inability to figure this situation out, which has been, frankly, very incomprehensible to a lot of people. It took me years to find it. And if I hadn't stumbled across some of the stuff that I found that does really explain it, as far as I can tell, or what it seems to me, I was among those too, who just was trying to reconcile all of what was happened, because there is a big issue, and it goes beyond merely what I call the Sedevacantism finding itself, because the Sedevacantism finding is actually pretty basic. You're ready for that finding, or maybe you've already embraced it when you're ready to pick up this book. You've seen enough of what the church has always taught, and the contrast between that and what gets served up at your local St. Miscellaneous's Novus Ordo, place. And there's a difference, there's a contradiction, and what that has to mean about all of those who are involved with that. It's a different religion, it's a different church, and it's led by a leader who is clearly, whatever he is, he's not a pope. But where do you go from there? And I was just thinking, I looked at the introductions and prefatory material that I had just as a quick background for that. So the Sedevacantism finding, I'll just read one paragraph here. It says, to some, this finding itself seems shocking. To others, it solves all things. While it certainly does solve many things, and especially those relating to the practical needs of individual Catholics, clerical, and lay, to carry on faithfully in our times, The fact cannot be ignored that the Sedevacante finding, while solving one batch of questions, raises another. These new questions were intimidating enough to cause Archbishop Lefebvre to hesitate, as he mused, quote, "But can one, practically speaking, maintain the formal heresy of a pope? Who will have the authority for that? Who will give the necessary warnings to the pope that it might be recognized? Furthermore, this line of reasoning and practice puts the church in an inextricable position. Who will tell us where the future pope is? How can he be designated, since there are no cardinals, because the pope is not the pope?" I hope that helps us understand the Archbishop a little better. I mean, it wasn't just trying to be diplomatic or political or whatever, although that may be also a part of it. But I think he really didn't know where to go from here. Okay, if he's not the Pope, what does that tell us about where the church is? And he didn't, nobody in his circle of people he knew at the time had the faintest idea where to go with that observation. Where do you go with that?
Well, and he had been a member of this hierarchy that then apostatized. Just
Wow.
imagine being part of that group, and then just seeing everything collapse. I mean, from under you, just completely kaboom, and it's gone. And they go and
Yeah.
create a whole new church while you are part of it. And it's hard to even imagine.
Yeah. So I, but strangely enough, the response was not, even though there's no, negative reviews of my book anywhere, or any bad commentary that I have yet ever seen, and it seemed, at least at the time, that the clergy, insofar as they knew of it at all, seemed to respond positively to it. They could see I'm trying to take a neutral and positive approach. That's why I don't take any sides in my resurrection book, between any of the various stripes of traditional Catholicism. I really don't. And it's not because they're all equally good or equally valid, or even that they all have uses in providence, but it's simply that I'm not about to say somebody's not a Catholic because he's content to go to the Motu Mass or some such thing. I'm not prepared to say that. Yeah, I mean, here's the thing: advanced theology, through 99.9 something percent of all of church history, it has never been incumbent upon the ordinary laity to become advanced professional theologians.
Right.
Now, suddenly it is.
Right.
And we're not equipped for it. As most laity, we don't have, we got families to feed, and, we can't sit around and go to seminary for 10 years and become THDs in theology and ecclesiology and canon law and all these other isms and ologies you can think of, and be in a position now to be able to evaluate what we've got and how we know what we know and what the truth would be. We don't have that, and to expect that of laity is just unfair.
So someone mentioned it to me. I don't remember. I think it was someone on a podcast. I don't remember, but they were saying that, back in the day, a theologian, that was his primary job. Like he obviously would usually be a priest and he would say the mass, but then he would just be a theologian. He would study, he would learn the law of the church, all these different things. And these are brilliant, brilliant men. I mean, geniuses probably a lot of the time, and they're brilliant. And that's all they did. That was their one job practically, was to study this and to be theologians. And now we have 18-year-olds on Twitter trying to act like they understand canon law. And it's just like, guys, it's like, I understand why they want to. I understand the issue, because as you said, we are put in a place where it's like, okay, what is the answer and who has it? And it's really difficult. And so I understand why people want to have the answers and want to find them. But it is so dangerous for people, as you say, totally untrained and unread, to go and start spouting out stuff that they think they understand. It's a difficult time.
Yeah. And even my own resurrection book in its original draft suffered a little bit from the fact that what I knew about the faith was what I gleaned from the traditional Catholics. Now, they had a lot of good sources and books, very devout and wonderful and holy, holy books they pointed to. And so I had read a lot of those. So I actually kind of came to know probably a lot more in a lot of ways. But I didn't yet have the advantage of having gone through the actual known professional theologians. In fact, the one most serious one I had gone through even before I really was discovering all of tradition, was the Catholic Controversy by Saint Francis de Sales. Now, there's a lot of really good material in there. He talks about how the church had to be visible, how the church has to have the various evidence of divine powers and so forth through its miracles, through so many other things that most people don't think about, and the Novus Ordo already doesn't live up to. So, but this was just one book from one writer, and he's really writing to the laity of Switzerland more than anything else, in the various essays and tracts that were gathered up into this nevertheless truly splendid volume, which I cannot recommend it highly enough. But I also wanted to take something stronger, so I found Van Noort. And this is one. I've got actually all three of his volumes, but this is obviously the one that has the most to say that is directly pertinent to where we're at. So, Dogmatic Theology, Volume 2, Christ's Church, on Senior G. Van Noort, and it's translated. Okay, so by going through Van Noort, I started finding a lot of good stuff, good rock solid teaching. And the best part is, I can take any quote and look at the whole context. What is he really saying here? What does the quote mean, and what doesn't it mean? And that's when I began realizing this is practically the bedrock. There are other writers, and I could have picked others. And in fact, I would come to refer to various others, such as Sylvester Berry, Father Sylvester Berry, or Saint Bellarmine, or Ludwig Ott, various others that also have a lot of things to say about these things. And sometimes there's even minor disagreements, not so much on anything believed, but maybe how it is to be expressed, that need to be known, understood, and acknowledged and faced. Because there are some questions that you could say might not have been settled by the church. And I am not going to presume to settle any of those questions on my watch.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's one of the things, my friend who wrote the forward, the forward to my Sedevacantism book. I actually had a friend write that. And he was somebody we corresponded with for a long time. And one of the great praises, which is an unusual one, is that he says, there's nothing dependent upon any minority finding, that is to say, or minority opinion of the theologians, though some are discussed, nor does this work pretend to resolve any of the legitimate theological questions existing before the outset of our current situation. Mm-hmm. Because that's just not my place. I have to stick with what is resolved. And if something isn't resolved or semi-resolved or whatever. So as we go through these books, and especially just Van Noort, it's in English. That makes it easy. I can quote him directly. Plus, my Latin is, how's your Swahili? It's probably about the same, right? Unfortunately. I mean, I never had much capacity for language, an interest, but not a capacity. It's like I'd like to know how to do a lot of things, and I try them, and I once tried to learn how to shoot, and all I found was I can't hit the broadside of a barn. So I kind of have to recognize where I have my talents and where I don't. But what Van Noort had to say, and the best way was to go through it. So I started a video series based on that, and I got about 2/3 or so of the way in. And by the time I got that, I had covered an awful lot of material, explained a lot of things. The only thing is, who wants to sit and watch a video series? I know I'm making one now, but but a lengthy one. I mean, I made 73 installments of Van Noort. That takes a while, and there's a few people who've gone through those, but you can count the views on those YouTubes, within on a couple of hands worth of fingers, because it's kind of hard to do, even though it's all right there and undeniably rock solid. I mean, you want to argue with Van Noort, your argument, and that's the thing. You want to argue with him, you want to say he's wrong about something, you got a lot to prove.
Right.
And I doubt he'd be wrong on anything consequential. So that's where we put together the book here. And what I had to realize was that I was back actually being challenged, because people didn't take what I had to say in the resurrection book and say, this is a great idea, and start looking in the right place for the solution, for what we need to do, for how we need to work together, how we can respect each other as Catholics while we work together for the, well, it's not so much the resurrection of the church, but the restoration. So I say resurrection because it's the resurrection life of Christ, not that the church is gone and has to be resurrected. And I specify that in the book in a few places because it has to be that way. So let's see here. What's another quote here I wanted to look at? Okay. So I was trying to get some way to work with some sort of a traditional bishop or at least some priest of considerable gravitas, someone who would work with me on the things that I'd been learning and reading and discovering. But I wanted to work with somebody who A, is clerical and B, has been trained in this whole thing and would have, a pretty good idea, be able to keep any ideas I have that don't work out in check. Right. But I couldn't find that. I tried to lay some ideas in front of somebody, and rather than just say, well, this isn't right, or look, here's what's wrong here because of this doctrine and that doctrine and so forth. Well, something just went wildly astray. And this book actually got its start. I talk about this in my preface. It goes like this here. Let's see here. When I first wrote and published my resurrection book some years ago, I had documented therein the actual steps being taken by many Catholics, cleric and lay, towards the continuing and sustaining of the church through these times. Every traditional Catholic, let me see, this is not the one. Well, not too bad. Well, this is also a good point. Every traditional Catholic, no matter what stripe or role or lineage, despite the rivalries and internecine doubts and criticisms, was already behaving and had been so from the beginning, exactly and precisely as if they were already aware of what I present herein, at least on an intuitive and inarticulate level. In short, what I have to say is already vindicated in the actual practice of all actively traditional Catholics, bar none. So it's like, it's already being vindicated. But oh gosh. Anyway,
so what is it then that is there something that's controversial in your? I mean, obviously, Sedevacantism is controversial. I mean, that goes without saying, and I know that there are plenty of opinions of how we get out of this situation. Or I guess there aren't that many.
Maybe
4 or 5.
Yeah, I think part of it had to do with the jurisdiction and so forth. So the point being is that my volume 1 assumes you're familiar with the differences, you've seen what's wrong, you've seen the disparity, and I don't require that you figured out the Sedevacante finding, though the first couple of chapters proper are dealing specifically really with that finding. But it's bigger than that finding because it's not just you got a pope for whatever reason not being a putative pope, I should say, not really being a real Catholic pope. Why is it? Is it just the man's own moral failings? Is that all there is? Like, we could have had this happen to us at any time, and it was just lucky us that, Pope, this or that numberth way back when didn't decide to be a heretic and deceive the whole church thereby. But was it just luck? There's more at work here. There's what I call the promises of God. And those cannot be ignored. Those cannot be just set aside. And it cannot be claimed validly that God's promises all just mysteriously evaporated and don't apply to anybody anymore.
Right.
That is something that can never be the case. I mean, I don't know. Am I talking out of? Am I saying anything meaningful here, or am I just
Sounds right to me.
Yeah, that's what I would have thought. So, if that's really the case, then getting to the bottom of what's going on is going to be a whole lot more than simply one of, well, it must be that all these people are moral failures and they all just don't care what's true or false, or they're just so enamored of their pet theories and ideas or whatever else that they, again, don't care what's true and want to go off, and they've abandoned their search for truth and want to go off in search of a good fantasy. Is we used to have T-shirts
Right,
that said
the bad dad theory, right? That you hear from the R&R often say, oh, there have been bad popes before, and you know, just because your dad is a bad dad doesn't make him not your dad anymore. And it's just kind of like, it's not the same, guys. It doesn't correlate.
There's an ontological difference, but that's getting ahead of ourselves. So we observe these things, and we talk about the Sedevacanti in the first couple of chapters. So now, the way I've written this, once I get to the book proper, is that each chapter takes what I call a doctrinal category. And that is because there's usually several doctrines, or at least doctrinal points, particularly relevant to our situation today, that extend to this particular doctrinal category. So they start with the indefectibility of the church. I actually started off with that one. So has the church defected? Well, you look at the association led by Bergoglio, there's no way to say that it hasn't defected. I don't think you could claim it hasn't defected even on the strength that, well, you've got this isolated little corner in Unga Bunga, or out in some Catholic Shangri-La that all the rest of us don't know where it is and can't find, but we're certain it exists, and on the strength of that, the church hasn't defected. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it sounds a little iffy.
Yeah. Iffy. Okay. I even to consider it iffy is probably what one would say if one doesn't have a better alternative. I don't think one would even consider it iffy if you had a better alternative that you could see, yeah, it's got to be this other thing. And but you don't have this other, idea. And you're kind of looking at this, well, iffy. Yeah, like you say, iffy. Okay. So, because it's just plain old has. But we have a dogma that it won't. Where does that get fulfilled? Well, this kind of couples with the next part too. It's one of the few cases where I kind of have to tie two chapters together within the chapters before I start summarizing things and tying everything together. So the next one is called the infallibility of the Pope and Church. Because you see, infallibility isn't something that's uniquely just the Pope. The Pope, you see, has, of course, active infallibility. He will teach us what is true. He will tell us to avoid what is false. And we can depend on him to do that no matter what personal, moral, or other failings the man may potentially have in some cases. But there's also there's a passive infallibility of the church. And that passive infallibility even goes all the way back to Scripture. The sheep know the shepherd's voice, and another voice they will not follow. So if you have a bunch of seeming sheep who follow the non-shepherd, not just grudgingly go along with stuff they don't trust until something better comes along, and then they're ready to join tradition, they'll want to right away. They may have to think about it a bit and realize and pray about it, and then realize they need to go with tradition. You say, but really go along with this and just embrace the whole new religion, they're already not sheep. I mean, I'm sorry, how much personal guilt is debatable. That's for God to judge. But they're not sheep, because if they were the church as a society, they would not accept the heretical direction. And so I say that this passive infallibility displays itself every place that any one of these people have seen some new thing being foisted upon them and says, this doesn't seem right. Why would somebody have to say that? Their supposed Pope just said, we have to use this new Protestant ceremony. I don't know about that. I mean, I want to respect the man because he's a Pope and all, but I don't know. I don't think I can buy this. I don't know, Just right there is the passive infallibility of the church in operation in the soul of that person. So that too is part of the doctrine. And so there's a lot of discussion about infallibility, mostly of the Pope, but a little bit of the passive infallibility of the church in chapter 2, where I talk about the infallibility of the Pope and the church. So then it's time to move on. Now, these are the basics. I'm starting with these basics, okay? But we need to move on because there's a whole lot more. As I said earlier, the Sedevacantism finding solves a number of problems and questions, but it creates new ones. We need to start pursuing those new ones and to look at this whole matter theologically. So, number 3, the authority of the church. This is probably the one big area where it's also, again, controversial. Where is the jurisdiction of the church? If you want to claim it's nowhere, that's already been affirmed as dogmatically impossible. You wouldn't necessarily be called a heretic for going against a mere doctrine of the church, theological note-wise. When you go against a dogma of the church, any statement of the church that has the theological note of dogma, you go against that. That is a bona fide, full-blown heretic, pure and simple. Right. And it turns out the authority of the church is a dogma of the church. So that, to me, right in itself, implies an awful lot that really needs to be meditated on. Because I'll just read, from Van Noort that I quote. Now, here's again, quoting at length. Again, short quotes are not good enough. Okay. So Van Noort writes, and I always have the citation exactly where to find it in that volume of his. So volume 2, pages 32 to 33. The Church of Christ is a hierarchical society. Catholic teaching holds that Christ himself established a sacred authority in his church, and that this authority, invested first in the Apostolic College, was uninterruptedly perpetuated and, in fact, perdures today in the College of Bishops. Proposition 1. Christ established a sacred authority in his church when he directly bestowed on the College of his Apostles the power to teach, to function as priests, and to rule. So, okay, hear all that. The power to teach, the power to function as priests, and to rule. Now, our traditional clergy have got that function as priest parts down pat. They get A pluses in that score altogether. To teach, well, they do teach, usually at best by just pointing to all the standard sources, and you can't go wrong there. So they get good grades, at least straight A's, if not necessarily A pluses there, because sometimes they get into their own theories where they're trying to explain a situation that I think for the longest time no one really understood. So I don't fault anybody for making a false explanation or a mistaken one, but it's time to realize that they don't hold up. And then finally, and to rule. Now, this is an area where, they do rule. Every time they absolve somebody in penance, every time they recognize a marriage, every time they tonsure a seminarian, for that matter. That's a juridical act too? It is.
It makes sense, yeah.
Yeah, that's a juridical act. It's not a sacrament at all. I mean, everything after that, from the minor orders through the major and so forth, are actual sacramental holy orders of varying degrees. But the tonsure is not a sacrament. But what it is a juridical change upon the person that transfers them from the laity to the clergy. And that is a juridic act. So, but they've done this, and they've done it to all apparent divine approbation. God blesses all of this. Very obviously.
But wouldn't they say, though, that it's supplied jurisdiction, right? It's the epikeia. It's the necessary jurisdiction rather than the ordinary.
Well, that's a thought. Could supplied jurisdiction even apply to this? Well, okay, that gets into hairy areas of discussion. There is a book about supplied jurisdiction, Myaskowitz, I believe. I was looking through all of that, and it's kind of interesting. Supplied jurisdiction, is a rather fascinating science, and it does convey a lot. But is it enough for everything that goes on? That's a bigger question. Because you could justify an individual cleric doing an individual act, maybe even the tonsuring of a seminarian, on the strength of this. But if that's all that any Catholic cleric around the world has to work with, you don't have a church there. You begin to see there's got to be more to all this than just, he's not the Pope, problem solved.
Right. Right. Yeah. So where lies the authority, right? And that's obviously an issue that we've come down to. Most everyone listening to this knows the differences between Bishop Sanborn and the thesis holders and others, and that's a big question. On this podcast, Bishop Sanborn said that that the bishops, the Sedevacantist bishops, hold as much jurisdiction as garbage men. That was a direct quote on this podcast, and that's so. If that's the case, then it leaves an interesting question. Then obviously, where is the authority? So I'm curious to hear your opinion or what you say in the book. Where is the authority?
I have to say, well, that's why I don't give him an A+ for Catholic teaching. Okay, but well, among other reasons, but that's definitely a very key one there, because if there really isn't any conventional authority among there, where does that leave? Outside, among the Protestants and the Anglicans and whatever? Obviously not. Okay, I think we all agree on that one. Among the Novus Ordo, this seems to be where people are trying to locate authority. And as we will get into later chapters, we'll explore that from a doctrinal standpoint, because there's a lot of doctrines that speak to that very idea. And by the time you get through these, it's like it really couldn't be there, or at most, it would have to be among those who at least show themselves in their public profession to be at least apparently Catholic. It might be possible to say, for example, Bishop Rifan might have jurisdiction because at least he appears to be a Catholic. He says the Catholic Mass, he does the Catholic sacraments, he does everything he can to try to keep his flock there in Campos, as Catholic as he can. How well he succeeded, that's another question, but I give the man credit for trying. Okay? But I don't see anybody pointing at him as a possible source of jurisdiction. And frankly, I'm not totally sure why. Is it just because he's too friendly with the modernists? Well, if you're going to look for somebody somewhere on the Vatican organizational chart, that's what anybody is going to be. They won't be on that organizational chart unless they're willing to be publicly affiliated with these known modernists and heretics and apostates. Okay. So, who furthermore, other than the rare exceptions like Rifan or maybe some folks out in the Eastern or other alternate rites, maybe, I can't rule that out. I don't know each of the rites and who's in them well enough to speak to the details on that. I at this point, I do have to confess my own lack of knowledge in terms of most of the specifics. I have some, but what I have is way too little to really be someone who has business writing on the subject in any real detail. I can acknowledge it as I go and move on. That's about all I can properly do. But, is that where we're going to find it? Some Byzantine Rite bishop somewhere, a Ruthenian Rite bishop somewhere in some place we don't know how to find him, is sufficiently Catholic in his soul and in his keeping of those under him sufficiently valid and truly Catholic rites and not engaging in this stuff with the schismatics of his area and so forth. Maybe somebody like that might exist. I haven't scoured the whole planet. Is that going to be how we say, the church still has authority?
Right. But it seems like authority and visibility should work together, right?
That's another bucket of bananas. Right. One of my own little story, I'm going to, if you don't mind a slight diversion here. I have a story where I once worked at an office where I would park in the parking lot, and there was this space that for some reason usually seemed to be open. And I would just stick my car in there and nobody ever seemed to mind. And I just parked in there every day. And then one day I found that there was a car parked in front of that, making it very hard to get out. But I got out because whoever left it there just left it there and walked away. I didn't know where they were, and it's none of my business. But then the next day I get another complaint, or same thing happens again. And it says, "You don't work here." And I says, "Well, no, what's here?" "Well, this is another office. There's two or more different companies in the building. Mine and then apparently this other one. There is no sign on the door saying what or who they are. And furthermore, the only thing on there was a cryptic little mark on the curb that said Cas Res, CISRES. I don't know. Maybe that means it's reserved for cars. Don't park your motorcycle here. I don't know. So it turns out that this other office that has no name and in fact was hiding from everybody was something known as Casmalia Resources. And they were the ones responsible for managing the toxic waste dump in our area. And they were the kind of, people would probably throw bombs through their windows or, protest there or something if they knew where this office was. So they can't put their name on the door, but they were in charge of the waste dump. Now, did I violate any authority by parking in that spot? You know, this authority has to have visibility or it's a fiction.
Right.
Somebody has to be in charge. If nobody's in charge, you know, then you can say, yeah, there's no authority. Nobody's in charge. We're all just a bunch of random, you know, individuals with no valid criteria for anybody to have anything to say to anybody else. You know, from a dominant from the standpoint of, you know, ordering somebody to do something or not do something on the basis of, you know, authority. You see, but they do that. You know, Sanborn may say he's got this, but he talks to seminarians. So, I mean, even the ability to have supply jurisdiction, you know, has to imply more than just you have valid orders. You're trying to do a certain thing. It's part of a certain thing. You are serving as a pinch hitting, as it were, for the church. Is he pinch hitting for the church? I have to credit him with that. Absolutely. You know, but even the bare ability to do that is more authority. So let me see a little more from Van Noort on this. He talks about what these functions are. Talks about the power to teach, function of priest, and rule. The threefold power to teach, the function of priest as the rule, corresponds to the threefold office which Christ as man was invested, for he was prophet, priest, and king. And so, by bestowing on the apostles the aforesaid threefold power, he made them sharers in the same powers which he, in his human nature, received from the Father, although not in the same fullness. We don't have the power to just work miracles as he did. Okay, and well, we frequently mention this connection in the College of Apostles, for the aforementioned powers were given to the apostles, not as so many individuals having no ties with one another, but inasmuch as they constituted a unit, a college. Indeed, why would Christ, who wanted to found one church, have given the power to rule the 11 men completely independent of one another? The matter will be explicitly treated in Article 2. Finally, the sacred power was conferred on the Apostolic College directly. So this, and then we get to the kicker here. The proposition is a dogma of faith, as we know from various definitions of the church. See the Council of Trent, section 23, canon 4, the Vatican Council, Constitution de Ecclesia. So we're talking dogma here. Dogma tells us that authority has to exist. And even if we were to concede the existence of some faithful, you know, Ruthenian bishop whose name none of us know, who passes some bare minimum threshold that even though he's actually affiliated with the same apostate pseudo-pope as our local Novus Ordo St. Miscellaneous, is somehow this guy could still be said to have real jurisdiction as a bishop. What good does it do us here, say in the United States or Canada, Mexico, you know, Poland, Argentina, wherever, Germany, you know, we're not under that. We're not under that bishop's jurisdiction. We have no appeal to him.
Right.
What good is that would do it, even assuming it exists? You know, there has to be authority here too. Normally, you lose a bishop, there's still the Pope. You lose the Pope, there's still the bishops. I guess if you lose the Pope and a bishop simultaneously, then things get a little tougher. But that's where the church sees a situation that it will do something to remedy as quickly as possible, either by providing a pope or, as what happened in the 1200s, by providing up to 21 bishops, even in the absence of any pope to name any of these bishops. So, I mean, the church carries on one way or another, but we carry on. We don't just allow an authority-less situation to, there it is, it's too bad, there we are. If you really thought authority doesn't exist, who's going to elect the Pope?
Right, okay. Exactly. That's the question, right? Apostolicity, too.
Yeah. So anyway, so that's doctrine number 3. And I talk about that and kind of apply that. Doctrine number 4, visibility of the church. You mentioned it yourself. Authority and visibility are so interchangeable, intertangled with each other, that how can authority have any meaning without visibility? How can somebody be in charge if nobody knows that they're in charge? They have to assert, hey, I'm in charge here. This is how things have to go. So, And if you can't see anybody doing that, where's the visibility? So it talks about the visibility of the church. And again, Van Noort has a lot to say about that, and so some of the others here. Now, chapters 5, 6, 7, 8, and 9 all pertain to the 4 marks of the church. Now, 5 just mostly introduces the 4 marks in general. It does, the main point I would say is that the 4 marks occur together. Okay? So if one were to say, and I know of a statement that says this, I'm not going to point a finger at anybody, but I've seen this in print, where somebody says, well, we have to admit that the Novus Ordo church, lacks the marks of unity and holiness. Okay, that's true so far as it goes. It does lack those marks. What about the marks of Catholicity and apostolicity? Nothing is said. And that is dangerous, because it leads one to wonder if maybe they do have one or the other or both of those marks. That is intrinsically impossible. The marks go together. If you have any one of them, if you really truly had any one of them as defined in its supernatural sense, you would have all 4. If you lacked any one, you would lack all 4. So that's probably the key point to emerge out of chapter 5. And then chapters 6, 7, 8, and 9, I'm taking each of the marks one by one. What does the mark of unity tell us? What does the mark of holiness tell us? What does the mark of Catholicity tell us? And finally, what does the mark of apostolicity tell us? I think we mentioned briefly last discussion, that the mark of Catholicity requires not only that it's everywhere, but also through time. And as we know, the whole Vatican II religion did not exist until Vatican II. So you already don't have a Catholicity of time. Ergo, they lack that mark, no matter how widely they may be spread and distributed around the world.
Right.
Yeah. So I spent a lot of time talking about the marks. I did some of that in my resurrection book, but from a very, like I said, a real layman's, almost worm's eye view. Now here I've got the doctrines, the dogmas that pertain to these things. And by discussing them at length, it really comes down to, you got a problem with what I'm saying. Your problem isn't with me. It's with Van Noort and all the other theologians with which he agrees. So you're taking them on. I'm just the guy who's passing it along here, and then the most I could be said to be adding is pointing out what is almost obvious enough that maybe you almost don't need much more than the quotes themselves. So, but it continues. Now, one more that's really basic is what I call the supernatural protection of the church. It is a historic fact, all down through history, the way the church has been supernaturally protected through all kinds of different ages, through all kinds of different crises and problems and troubles and struggles and persecutions and every other situation you can imagine. Now, if you're going to say, by this point, one will have gone through all of this, I will have shown, A, how the Vatican organization lacks all these marks and attributes. Patently, they have defected. Patently, their leader is very followable. Their followers are very followable. Patently, while they may have a kind of, patently, they have no real Catholic authority, right? I mean, and I think that's probably one of the main reasons people think authority's disappeared, is because the Vatican characters have lost authority.
Right.
So it's like, well, if they don't have it, it must be gone. No, but we already learned dogmatically that is not possible. Either they retain it, and you got to go for this resist but recognize model, and I think we all know that doesn't work out very well. Or you've just got to say, then there must be somebody else who has it. And that's where we begin to see the identity of the traditional Catholic community for what it really is. Authority can only reside amongst those who are obviously, visibly, palpably Catholics. Everything else is automatically eliminated. One might as well place spiritual authority among the Baptists.
Right.
So
but then the question then would be, I mean, how then do we elect a new pope? Because I think that's where we get hung up with a lot of people with the authority, right? I don't think the issue even is necessarily the visibility or the authority. The question is then, okay, yeah, that sounds good, but then how do we have electors to have a new pope? Because without a pope and that promise of a pope, then we can't have a church.
Okay, well, let me go off script a little bit because there are later chapters where I talk about exactly that. Well, man, let's see, I'm almost there. I'll just jump through this part rather quickly and I'll get to that.
Sure.
So anyway, the supernatural protection of the church, there's no way to say the church has been supernaturally protected today, except the existence of we traditional Catholics. If we didn't exist, you would have to say the church has had no supernatural protection. It just got lucky for a long time, and finally, at length, that luck has run out. There never was any protection. They were just lucky, and now, okay. Or the protection exists, and we are the manifestation of that protection, the lone possible manifestation of that protection. So then we move on into more specialized topics, and these can raise more interesting challenges, but these are doctrines that need to be known, acknowledged, and studied. 11, Rome, the eternal diocese. Okay, that's a big can of worms. 12, the need for visible external actions. The church has, it's a visible church, meaning it has to do things visibly. And one of the key things I draw from there is that I don't believe that an institution or established organization, society can go from being the mystical body of Christ to not being the mystical body of Christ through an invisible process. Yeah, mull that one over a little because that's
right.
Yeah, it can't do that through an invisible process. There really had to be some way they not only made a break with the past, but that they also established that the past exists as something other than themselves.
Right.
So you'll find that in every schism. Let's take England. What happened in the 16th century? I mean, did priests and bishops just kind of start wandering off in all directions, and because they're bad people or they just don't have any moral or spiritual sense, and it just kind of randomly happened? No, a very specific and identifiable thing took place when the king, Henry VIII, had every cleric sign this thing called the Declaration of Royal Supremacy, by which they established the king as their pope and not the pope in Rome. So now there are those who have the pope in Rome, and he was perfectly content to let the rest of the world have the pope in Rome as their pope. But we here in England have our king as our pope. And when you have that visible separation, that's how the Anglican Church was born, before it even had any unusual liturgical details or practices or all the weird theology they came up with by people like Hooker and so forth. That happened first, and all the other stuff that came afterwards, their vernacularization, that's a tough word for me, their just general loss of real unity, to the point you got high church and low church and broad church, and all this stuff comes after they were separated from the church. They separated themselves from the church by an official document. Something happened. Again, in the East, at 1054, they didn't just start wandering off and deciding to question whether Mary was immaculately conceived or not and say, well, it's okay if you think she's not. Or they didn't just start deciding that, well, the Holy Ghost only comes from the Father, but not from the Son. They weren't coming up with this idea until somebody over there decided to excommunicate the Pope. Again, that was an official document by which the Patriarch of Constantinople excommunicated the Pope in Rome, and in that thing created everything that was separate. They were separate, they were cut off, they were a branch cut off from the tree, and they started to fade and die. Now we see what seems to be the whole world, like a branch cut off, fading and dying. Something had to have happened, and in all these cases, there was something visible. And it is my insistence that there is something visible here, because dogmatically, I just showed that something visible has to exist. What that may be, that's for volume 2. But for volume 1, I simply show that it has to be something visible. So we should be looking for that. We should have been looking for that from the very beginning. But instead, we just seem to think, well, I don't know, people are just kind of losing it and we don't know why. All right, 13, object of infallible ecclesiastical faith. Well, that's a very subtle thing. You have to get to it. Here we go again. Before one's can really meaningfully know what I'm talking about. It's actually a point taken from Van Noort, Volume 3, by the way. Okay, 14. The first see is judged by no one. It is a concept. We don't go judging the first see. So we have to tread carefully when doing anything that looks like judging the first see. See, when we talked about Sedevacantism, and especially in the opening couple of chapters, we're looking at it from the standpoint of just ourselves. There's a maniac shooter on top of the building across the street, and we've got to hide from him. We don't have to wait for him to be caught, tried, found guilty, sentenced, and thrown in prison or whatever before we're allowed to say, yeah, that's a wild shooter. We can respond immediately by protecting ourselves. This is our own personal level of being Sedevacantist. But obviously, the church has to go beyond that level. We need to recognize as a canonical fact that these characters are not pope, that not only are they heretics, but that they are not popes, that their cronies are not real bishops of the church, and so on. So when we get to that area, how do we do that? And especially the fact is we have to tread very carefully. Sometimes I think people don't trust a Sedevacantists because they think we're trying to step into that immediately on the basis of our own little puny authority. Well, I disagree with him, so that means he's not pope. What good is that? That's not what we're doing. But, before we start saying he's not a pope, not merely as our own private observation, what we do to protect ourselves, but as something we have to put out there as an objective truth, we have to be able to tread carefully, to take it very slow. And, you don't stop the investigation, but it's like a speed bump. You've got to proceed cautious and slow and carefully. And that's an important admonition. Doesn't mean you can't do it. It just means you have to take it carefully. And I don't think most people have been careful. You talked yesterday about jumping straight to graduation and so forth. But how does that happen? I think usually somebody just says, well, I disagree with the guy, so that makes him not pope to me. If that's all you really want to say, okay, but well, all right, he's not to you, but he is to me. So what? You see?
Right.
That's why all this other steps, could be important. Now, to some degree, they're kind of a diversion. You're right, and maybe skipping some of them could be done fairly swiftly, or stepping through them, or skipping them altogether could probably be done. But again, one needs that basic time, that theological formation, time to meditate on these things. We overlook the prayer of meditation, thinking on these things, contemplating them. So, all right, moving on. 15, universal teaching of all the bishops. That one's probably the toughest one to deal with, because if all the bishops are saying something, that's pretty serious. It's almost as serious as a pope, saying something by supreme and extraordinary, magisterium. All right. And finally, 16, the church is a perfect society. A lot of good stuff there, but I'm racing through this now. And then 17, summary of basic findings. By this point, we've gone through what I call 16 doctrinal categories. We can step through all this stuff, put it together, and this already puts us in a place to be able to say on something of a canonical level that we really are dealing with a condition of sedevacante. And some of the other basic findings that are very important. Traditional Catholics really are the church from an institutional perspective. So, these things will have been, carefully, systematically proven step by step, layer by layer. You have to take it slow. You want to jump over the steps, you get to a declaration that if people don't understand and they don't agree with, let them try and defend the contrary. I let them, seriously. I'd like to see it done. It hasn't been, and nobody notices that.
Sure.
Yeah. All right, you're saying that Sandborn called the authority of all our bishops on par with that of a garbage collector. I had no idea garbage collectors were invested with so much spiritual authority. Maybe they are, and I just never knew about it. Because frankly, how is he going to defend that proposition? He doesn't. He can't. And it's nothing personal. He could be the most brilliant person who ever lived in human history. I don't believe there's a way he could defend that proposition. doctrinally, dogmatically, and so forth. He just says it, and we all just kind of, yeah, that's true. There's just no authority anywhere. Yeah, that's really what's going on. Nobody proves it. They just kind of assume it. Well, there's canonical procedures. Now, let me talk about that for a moment. Canon law is the handmaiden of theology, not the other way around. So if some set of canons made a theological dogmatic necessity impossible, it's the canons that give way, not the theology. Okay. Canons are good. They exist for a very important reason. And to a huge degree, we should still be able to observe them exactly as they were meant to be observed. We may have to make an adaptation in a few places, very few. You could probably count them on the fingers of one hand, where you might have to say, this canon cannot be legally applied today. Where the law becomes impossible, the law ceases to have effect. And we're talking all ecclesiastical laws. Yes, there are some canons that have a basis in revelation. Those obviously cannot cease. But there's a lot of them that are just ecclesiastical law. And where impossible, where the law is physically impossible to comply with, the obligation of itself ceases. This is why, since I live more than an hour's travel away from any Catholic Mass, the Sunday obligation does not apply to me personally. I go when I can make it, and I have mass prayers at home with my family all the times I can't. The law ceases. So, continuing. So now, we've brought it all together. Now we get to the key parts. 18, the apostolicity of the traditional Catholic bishops. So now that needs to be explained and justified in detail. It's a fairly long chapter, and I cover a lot of material, and the evidence is, well, I should think it's compelling. And now we get to the one you were asking about a while ago. I'm sorry I took so long here. 19, the ability of the church to provide herself with a pope. And so how would that work? Why would that work? Why have our other attempts failed? There are very good, strong, and understandable reasons from a theological standpoint why the other attempts, Michael Baden, Father Pulvermacher, Linus Peltz, and I don't know, maybe there's others, but those are the main ones I know who actually went through the motion of a conclave. Why did these papal things fail? There are reasons, and it wasn't just that they were small, paltry little things. There's a lot more to it. But it also ties back to the question of the authority. The authorities of the church have to be involved with it. They have to make it happen. They have to organize it, choose who the electors will be, whether they're from themselves or some other group that they trust or any combination. That's entirely up to them. They must choose. And then when it's been conducted, they must submit to the man so elected. If this doesn't happen, you don't have a pope. And until that happens, there will be no pope. And I said, well, maybe someday they'll actually elect a Catholic out there in Vatican City. Yeah, and with about equal likelihood, America will elect me to be the president of the United States. Okay, not physically impossible, but we know that's not going to happen.
I think both theories would take an act of God, most likely, because their point would then be, how do we get all, quote unquote, all of the bishops or the priests or the church to vote? I mean, or how do you get that? Who elects it? Who is the authority? Is it the traditional bishops? Is it the SSPX? Who holds it?
Well, I would say the traditional bishops taken together certainly have the authority to decide who that should be. They can decide themselves. They can choose some of their priests, or leave it to a list of priests whom a lot of them agree upon. And they can come up with a variety of algorithms. There might be some individuals that, well, I won't take so and so as a pope. Well, if it's just one person, maybe we'll allow that. We won't put that person on. Another bishop that, and I won't take that person as a pope. As long as we're just talking one person out of a pool of at least enough qualified claimants to leave something to choose from, we could probably even make allowances like that. We'd really have to carry this through in a very, very tough way. But, it's doable, providing we get everybody on board with that. Now, how do we do that? That's the key thing.
And who is everybody? I know that is that's Bishop Sanborn's main question. When you say everybody, who is everybody? How do we decide who is involved, who is invited in that group?
I would say everybody who seems traditional must be invited. Now, there'll be some who don't come. Individuals might be allowed not to come, although we want at least somebody to represent, the various schools of thought, the various Episcopal lineages, and so forth. We should do everything we can to strive that they're all represented among traditional Catholics. And hopefully somebody will have to discover what we're going to do for those of the Eastern Rite. But it'll all be the same thing. We have to, that would take some determination, and that's okay. They can think about that. They can argue over that for a bit, but they have to work together. Before that, just to be willing to be involved in that, here's where, again, I'm thinking what's needed is that we need to get to the doctrines. If we don't follow the doctrines, everybody's following their own opinions, and they're all over the place. The more you get to the doctrines, the more you realize what things have to be. So that's the only possible source of Catholic unity today, is in the thing we've already accepted tacitly, implicitly. We all accept the historical and universal magisterium of the Church. If you don't accept that, you're not a traditional Catholic. But every traditional Catholic I know of, I don't know, there'd be some weird guys on the fringe somewhere that I don't know about, but there could be potentially. But basically, everybody who has a right to the title of traditional Catholic, has signed up to the entirety of that, universal and historical magisterium of the Church. So if you adhere to that, well, the teachings that I've quoted in here are one and all part of that magisterium. So that's what really needs to get out there. And the more that starts getting out there, and this is also why, I will treat those, who maybe at earlier stages, the indolent mode 2, the SSPX, with some respect as people who are still learning. So like I would talk about, it may take time for somebody to realize that a practical absence of papal authority in the Church may in fact, and as we find out is in fact, caused by an actual lack of papal authority. But they've been going on, maybe it's an apparent or a seeming or a practical lack of papal authority, even if they've got somebody they call a pope, but they can't treat him like a pope. I don't call the SSPXers heretics for calling him pope. I think it's nuts. But I don't call him a heretic for that at all. And I'm not going to call Bishop Sanborn a heretic for bracing a thesis that it has some appeal. As Father than Bishop Gerard de Laurier came up with it, I have to have respect for it. But at the same time, it's become a theory that has increasingly become unable to justify the things that we've been seeing. How much weirder things have been since de Laurier himself was alive. How more extreme things have happened. And most of all, how many whole categories of people have died off, such as cardinals or bishops who were personally appointed by a real pope.
Right.
De Laurier did not envision non-pope,
right?
Having to create non-cardinals to elect more non-popes to create more non-cardinals until somehow, by some freak occurrence, a Catholic somehow emerges out of all this. So that is so unworkable. It would have made sense if, let's say, you still had some cardinals back in the days. Paul VI is still alive when he was writing his notebooks, beginning them. And then, and you had John Paul I, John Paul II. There were still a lot of cardinals who were, appointed by real popes. There were hundreds of bishops appointed by real popes. And a good many of them, even if only secretly or quietly, were still with Archbishop Lefebvre as having been part of that coitus paternum during Vatican II, about 250 Vatican II fathers who objected to everything that was going on. So there was a lot. And a number of those, I believe, supported Lefebvre to their deaths. But they fell, they died, and maybe some of them did compromise, and almost none of them did anything, unfortunately. And now none of those are left. So So how do we get a pope? Has to do with, you start with authority. If the authority of the church can be A, discovered to exist, and then B, recognized by ourselves, by the laity, by themselves, the priests and bishops themselves, and by each other, you see, now the church is in a position to do something to help herself. Right now, without that, we can't, and it's not going to happen. And if we don't organize it, if we don't make it happen, there won't be a pope. If the church has to go on for 600 years without a pope because we're just not willing to, organize one, then, we're going to be limping along and just hanging on by the barest, shoelace of hanging by a shoelace for however long that takes. I don't think God wants that.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. No matter how we come to a conclusion, I think that the lack of even trying for unity really blows me away. I mean, I feel like, I feel like maybe we get comfortable in our situation. We just think, well, we're Sedevacantists, we're Sedevacantists, and we've got priests, we got sacraments. It's like, no, literally, as Catholics, we cannot be comfortable in that situation. We have to have faith and hope in a pope. And I do feel like we get a little bit cozy in that situation where it's like, no, we have to have unity. We have to fight for unity, and we have to, try to find a solution. Maybe not the people, but the people, the laity can try to be unified and show charity and be Christ-like, for goodness sake.
Right. And encourage our priestly and episcopal leadership to do the same.
Sure.
Sometimes I think that they think they're catering to their flock by talking of other flocks as they're no good. They're not doing anybody any favors unless the devil. We have to learn to discover each other, to respect each other, even while we may have to disagree. But even a disagreement must be carried in a very respectful manner. I'm disagreeing because of this and that doctrine and this doctrine and that doctrine. What do you have to say about these doctrines?
Right.
I'll leave that to you. If you want to think about it a while, please do so. I'm not going to ask you to answer this right away because it's a lot to digest. It is. And in fact, really, this book is a huge amount to digest. So I don't expect people to just read this and 3 days later they've read it and they all know everything and they're ready to go. I know people can't do that. But they read it, the ideas start coming up, and they start coming out in various different places. And people who have read it, maybe they forget it, or maybe they weren't sure about it, but later on they find some point or other being particularly relevant to some situation or discussion that arises, and they start saying, we have, that's a really good point. And far be it from me to credit this Griff Ruby guy, whoever he is, but he did have one thing right when he said, that's a beginning. So, this is why this stuff is so important, and why the whole book is devoted to that. And then I have a little appendix on the back, and we mentioned briefly, no one's ever proved that authority doesn't exist among our traditional bishops. So they don't claim normal episcopal sees. Well, that's not necessary. And it's not even necessary to be an ordinary, as the church categorizes bishops who are ordinaries. As distinct from what? Well, mostly either retired or auxiliaries. And even auxiliaries do have a jurisdiction too, even though it's subject to the jurisdiction of their, the bishop ordinary and so forth. That's over them. So we can have auxiliaries, we can have other kinds of bishops. The key thing is the bishop in charge? And that's what we have to get to. If we really thought there's no authority, then, and let us take a painful thought here, if that were really the case, take Bishop Pavaronis. I love the guy. I think he's, of all the ones, all the bishops, I admire the most. Okay? Now, I believe he's in charge of the CMRI. It's up to him to decide who is or is not going to be welcomed, or maybe even, as the case may be, ordained as a priest for his society. If somebody in that society decides to buck the tide and and not go along with what he has for the CMRI, he can and does have the right and power to put that person out. The CMRI has a position. It's up to him to approve it. It's not up to any of us. I may have some commentary or thoughts about it, but it's up to him to approve or disapprove or to recommend a change. He has to do that, right? What it adds up to is he's in charge. Well, that's what jurisdiction is. It's being in charge. If there's really no jurisdiction, then he's not in charge. And the CMRI is just this bunch of guys who, gather together for no particular reason other than they're nice friends and enjoy chatting with each other, shooting the breeze. No, of course not. It's a society. It's organized. It has rules. It has the ability to say, we need to raise funds for this new building here. We need to do this. And, he has the authority to do that. And he uses that authority. And rightly so. So we need to start recognizing the actual acting authority, which is jurisdiction, on the part of our traditional bishops. So they recognize marriages. Some have even recognized annulments. They, they sponsor seminarians, as we discussed before. They, there's a whole list of stuff they're doing. In fact, that's when I get to chapter 18 in here. I have a whole list of the stuff that traditional bishops have variously done that are one and all juridical acts. So they may say, I don't have any authority, even while they go out and exercise the authority that the church, in fact, gave them. So I don't understand. Well, they get browbeaten. There's these armchair lay theologians. They read a book about something. They think they know everything, and they think all authority has just disappeared and evaporated. And they say, how dare you claim jurisdiction, Your Excellency? How dare you? And they get intimidated by this. And so they most of them won't discuss the subject at all, or they'll just bring up the supplied jurisdiction because at the very least, if you didn't have anything else, at least there'd still be that. But if that's all there is around the whole world, then the dogma about the authority of the church is already violated. There has to be more than that. Dogmatically, there has to be. What it is and who it is, the dogma itself does not tell us. It just tells us that it has to be somewhere. We are morally obliged to believe that. We are heretics because it's a dogma if we do not believe it. So that's why that's so important. And there will not be a pope until, key figures in the church can have the authority, be recognized with the authority they have, recognize each other, and be recognized by those of us who are their subjects, and so forth. Because when they get together and organize a conclave and submit to somebody as a pope, then all of us have a pope. I mean, what are you going to do when every traditional priest and bishop is submitted to pope something new, whoever they elect, and whatever name the person regnal name the person takes, when there might be one or two disgruntled priests who don't want to go along with this thing and they want to be kind of like a home aloner, but there'd be 5 of those on the whole planet, and none of them have any substantive reason. They just don't like pope whoever it was. You go to all others, you go to any priest or bishop affiliated with any of the societies you've had, and they're all going for pope, whoever this is, Pope X, who's obviously they wouldn't allow to be a non-Catholic or an idiot or any of the other kinds of stuff. It'd take a real saint to do this, but you have to be somebody, you see. Then there's no good reason not to go along with it. We have a pope. We say mass. When it comes with that pope, we have a pope. That's the only way. Without authority, because even though our authority does not give the pope his authority, that comes directly from God. But it is the authority among our leadership to impose the Pope's authority on the rest of us. So,
good stuff.
Yeah. So if the cleric doesn't like what I'm saying, he can do several things. He can just try to keep it in silence and not talk about it. I hope that gets harder and harder until he can't do that anymore as more people learn of this. He can try to debunk it somehow. I would welcome the attempt. because either he'll find something interesting that somehow, despite my very thorough researches, I've missed, and I would certainly be glad to know of anything of that kind, or three, he can just say, well, I'm your priest, I'm your bishop, and my authority, I tell you, don't read his books, don't read his stuff, don't look at that, and so forth. And you know what? If somebody says that, says, on what authority are you saying that? If you want to claim the ecclesiastical authority to insist that of me, then the point is already conceded, and I can back away. Like John the Baptist, I can decrease and they can increase. But if they're not going to accept that authority and say, well, I'm just somebody with no more authority than a garbage collector, well, you have an opinion, you don't like it. I have another opinion, I do like it. It's kind of an interesting stemmy, isn't it?
Sure. Good stuff. Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll have a debate sometime on the Catholic Family Podcast. I know the viewers would love that.
I would love to have an opponent in this thing. Sure. I remember this one about, it was in a fictional story taking place in some way outback somewhere, where the only person they can find, for both the mayor, the judge, the attorneys and so forth, it's just this one guy, because the town is so small. And he's saying, hey, the one thing I wish I had was an adversary. I kind of feel like that guy.
And the good thing, I mean, I think it's really important, again, that we can have disputes, we can have disagreements, and we can have different people on podcasts and talk about different things with different opinions. And it's okay. This is okay to disagree. It's okay to have debate. And that is, I think, fruitful if it's done in the spirit of charity, which I think, again, it seems very, very well that you're doing everything. I think your book, everything sounds charitable. And I think that's the key. And I think that, again, this podcast, the podcast before, the podcast coming next, it's not trying to sweep the rug out of anybody. It's trying to present, a theory or an opinion or research that you've done on doctrine. And I think that's important. So everyone to remember that it is not necessarily my thoughts. Your thoughts aren't necessarily mine. Bishop Sanborn's aren't necessarily mine. I mean, but that, again, it's okay. I think it's good to have these conversations, and we hope that no one is particularly offended. And if they are, as you said, then let's talk it through and see what we can figure out. And I think with that, we better get going. We've gone already an hour and a half. I mean, these conversations just they go so quick. It's amazing. And we still have part 3 coming up, which we hope to get to in a couple of days. But I'm going to leave you with last words, and then I'll wrap it up.
Oh, last words. Okay. Oh, goodness. Well,
better be good.
The important part is the theology. I mean, a significant percentage of this book is just quotes from a lot of Van Noort, but also Sylvester Berry, Robert Bellarmine, a little bit of Journet. I know there's some cautions about him. I discussed those actually in volume 2, but the cautions are fairly minor and readily addressed, and so forth. And these are the sources. And like I say, you want to dispute them, that's the problem. That's not me. You want to dispute the way I'm applying them? Okay, come up with another interpretation. And oh, by the way, make sure that whatever you come up with is a way to interpret what these people have said, other than the way I have, that you can also fit with how all the other passages say and what they impose and what we must believe. See, theology is a whole. It holds together. You don't just, otherwise you just have a bunch of ideas and principles and so forth scattered about the floor like so many broken toys, and you pick one up and you look at it a while, okay, and then you pick another one up, and you can't fix anything. You're just kind of sitting there looking at that. And that, unfortunately, seems to be what most Catholics have had to work with, almost regardless of perspective. So this is why the theology is important. Once you know that it's all supposed to fit together, you'll know how you can start working on how it fits together. And then you will see how it fits together. As I go through this book, each chapter, with maybe one exception, has questions. These are not questions like review questions like in a textbook. They are questions left open. I've solved everything, but there's an open question. Like if there's authority, we solved that there is. Question, who's the authority? That will be addressed in later chapters. You see, we're not ready to answer that question at the end of chapter 3, and so forth. Those questions do get resolved in time. And in the meantime, we have to track them, keep them on, and not just let them drop and go unacknowledged. So this is how everything will hold together and hang together as a cohesive whole, which Catholic theology has always done from the beginning. You don't have one guy specializing in, say, soteriology who's got one doctrine, but you got another guy who believes in eschatology who's actually saying something contradictory, and they'll get like this every time because this guy says this and that guy says. You don't have any of that. Everybody's got the same theology. I'll specialize this area, he'll specialize in that area, but everything seamlessly flows from one to the other. That's how theology is supposed to be. Now, if somebody wants to come up with another interpretation to the passages I put in here, I welcome the attempt. And let us see if they can, A, find better interpretations, and B, fit those better interpretations together into a cohesive whole.
Perfect. Mr. Griff Ruby, I appreciate it very much. Your books, the links to buying your books will be on the podcast show notes. We'll be back for part 3, which I think will get even more deep into the weeds of Sedevacantism, which I'm very excited about. It's probably going to be about 3 hours long. We'll have an intermission in the middle. I'm kidding. No, yeah, but I'm really looking forward to it. I really have appreciated the last 2 shows, and anyone who's watched and enjoyed this, please like, share, subscribe, all of those things. We're just trying to have a channel that talks about interesting topics and tries to, I don't think we're going to necessarily find answers, but I think it's good to have these talks and to really look deep into these things. And I've greatly appreciated having on Mr. Ruby. I've greatly appreciated having on Bishop Sanborn. Again, not necessarily everything I agree with. I really appreciate it. And I appreciate the time from you and from Bishop Sanborn. And I hope that and I want to make sure I said this because it just came to mind when I was saying Twitter theologians, I did not mean I was not talking about any priest or anybody I was talking about. This is just
right. I know
these young kids, these young armchair, you know what I mean? These young armchair theologians are just, oh, I read Bellarmine, so here you go.
Oh, so you know everything. Well, exactly. You might know a few things, but can you put that together with everything else you learned?
Exactly.
What else am I supposed to have learned? Exactly.
Perfect. All right. Until next time, Mr. Ruby, God bless.
Okay. You too.